So, Aite Discipuli, we're continuing with our review of Book 4 of Caesar's Gallic Wars, chapters 30 through 32. So what just happened was Caesar's fleet that was carrying the cavalry before was driven in a storm back to the continent, and therefore Caesar and his men are stuck in Britain, and they don't have any grain, and they also have a lot of ships that have been destroyed. So they're in a tight spot right now. Therefore, when these things were recognized, so when the enemy found out about this situation, the leaders of Britain, who after the battle had come to Caesar, talked among themselves, or to each other. Inter se always means to each other or among themselves. When they knew or understood that the Romans were lacking cavalry and ships and grain, and the scarcity, and they recognized the scarcity of the troops from the scantiness, or like the small size of the camp. Which camp was also narrower because Caesar had brought legions without baggage. Sounds like excuses from Caesar to me. They decided it was best to make a rebellion and keep our men away from grain and supplies, and to lead out or draw out the situation until the winter, because with these, that is the Romans, having been overcome or cut off from return, no one afterwards, for the sake of bringing in war into Britain, would cross into Britain. They were confident of this. So that's their plan. So, again, with another conspiracy made in a little while, that's the British leaders, departed from the camps and began to lead away their men secretly, like shut up in a clam. That's how I remember that. Secretly from the fields. So they're drawing off their troops, or drawing off their people, so the Romans won't be able to get supplies, and they're going to delay and basically just make the situation difficult for Caesar, and until he's forced to abandon his invasion in the winter. All right. Section 31. But Caesar, even if he had not yet recognized their plans, nevertheless, both from what happened to his ships, and from the fact that they had stopped giving hostages, he suspected that which happened. Like, he knew what was going to happen, basically. And so he was preparing insert footnote here, for all possibilities. For he was both bringing grain out of the fields daily into the camp, and whichever ships were most seriously afflicted, there's the ships, with their timber and bronze, he was using their timber and bronze for repairing the rest. This is use, like utility. And whatever was of use for these matters, he commanded to be carried from the continent. So somehow people are getting across from the continent still. And so With the greatest eagerness, this was administered to by the soldiers, with 12 ships having been lost. Caesar effected it, or like Caesar made it so that the rest could be sailed conveniently enough. There's could. All right, 32. We're like flying through this. It's amazing. While these things are done, with a legion, according to their custom, having been sent in one group to gather grain, the legion which was called the Seventh, so not Caesar's favorite necessarily, but maybe they're good guys too, and with not any suspicion arising at this time for war, like no suspicion of war at the moment, when part of the men remained in the fields, part also went to and fro in the camp. So like some of them were picking like wheat or whatever, and some of them were carrying it back to the camp in trips. Those who in front of the gates of the camp were in their station, their like guard tower thing, announced to Caesar that they saw a greater amount of dust, pulvis, than usual in that part, like where the 7th Legion had gone. So a greater amount of dust than usual in that part which the Legion had journeyed than was normal. So, that's a big boy paragraph actually. Caesar suspected what had happened, that it was some beginning of a new plan by the barbarians, and the cohorts which were in the station or in the guard tower to go with him into that part. There's to go. And then out of the rest of the cohorts, he had 2 groups take over the station or the guard tower, and the rest to be armed and immediately to go with him, to follow him. He commanded all those things. All right, when he had proceeded a little farther from the camp, he basically noticed that his men were being pressed or attacked by the enemies, and they were dealing with it badly. And the legion was like gathered together from all of the parts, and weapons were being thrown. He noticed all those things. Always has to end the sentence, always has to have the last word, is what Caesar does. For because with all of the grain, forgot that word, footnote, like gathered or something, from the rest of the parts, there was one part left. The enemies suspected that here our men would come, and at night they hid in the forest. So they knew like where the Romans would go next to gather grain, so they hid around there. And this had happened the night before. This was the ambush they'd planned. Then, having been dispersed, this is the Romans were dispersed with their weapons put down. There's weapons for gathering grain or harvesting, and they were occupied. Suddenly there arose, the enemies arose. Jeez, can't talk. It's late. And with a few having been killed, they disturbed the rest of the Romans in uncertain lines, because the Romans like to be very orderly, so they're not in their good order, which makes them more prone to attack. And at the same time, they surrounded, that's the British, surrounded the Romans. the 7th Legion with cavalry and our fancy war chariots. The end. Voilà.